Today on Blue 58, Devonte Wyatt is one of the most crucial pieces on the Packers defense, both for 2024 and for the future. Let's examine why.
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, and I'm very happy to be with you here for this episode because we're going to fix the entire NFL. We're going to do it just in one episode. But first I want to talk about Devonte Wyatt, not Devonte Adams. Nearly said Devonte Wyatt or Devonte Adams. That would be two episodes in a row. We made that mistake. Can't do it. We're going to talk about Devonte Wyatt because I wanted to pull on a thread that actually started a few months ago but continued into this last episode as well, where we talked about the present and future of the defensive line. Last episode we looked at it specifically to do with Kenny Clark. But this year, this episode, it's more on Devonte Wyatt. And I think there's a few reasons that Devonte Wyatt is a very interesting player for this year's Packers and beyond. First and foremost, I think he may benefit from the scheme change more than anybody else on the defense. His closest comp right now is Kenny Clark, the player whose career he is most likely to emulate. Just because they play the most similar positions. You can't really compare interior defensive linemen to edge rushers, especially as you're changing around different schemes. But Wyatt, if he wants to have a successful NFL career, should look to emulate someone like Kenny Clark, who can do a lot of different things and has been successful in a lot of different schemes. That's something that stood out to me looking back over the balance of Clark's career. He was good under Dom Capers. He was good under Mike Pettin. He was good under Joe Barry. And you'd be pretty reasonable to think he'd be good under Jeff Hafley too, because he's just a good player. Wyatt is going to be in a different scheme now, one that is apparently going to focus a little bit more on interior penetration from the defensive line, and that would seem to suit him pretty well given what we know about his skill set. But looking both at this year and the future from a roster-building perspective, I think that's where we really start to see Wyatt's importance. This year's defensive line group, your top four in some order, when you don't have to quibble about the order further down the depth chart. If you want different guys in different order, that's fine. But your top four guys, probably among the guys that are most similar, is Kenny Clark, Devonte Wyatt, Carl Brooks, and Colby Wooden. Throw TJ Slayton in there and you've got a pretty good top five. For 2025, only 3 of those 5 guys are under contract. Clark is currently scheduled to be a free agent, and so is TJ Slayton, leaving you with Wyatt, Brooks, and Wooden. Setting aside TJ Slayton for a second, just because he's a very different player than these other guys, that's a pretty thin group heading into 2025. If they decide to retain Kenny Clark, you still have your same top 4 for 2025 and beyond, because, again, these players I think are more similar than TJ Slayton is. If you don't, you're looking pretty thin, even if Wyatt does grow from where we saw last year into this year. If there's no Clark next year, you probably have to draft a defensive lineman anyway, even if you really like Carl Brooks and Colby Wooden. If you let Clark go, you're obligated to. And if you let Clark go and Devonte Wyatt struggles this year, then you're really in a situation where you need some help on the defensive line. So I think Wyatt can do the most in this group to offset any, or maybe smooth out any issues with the defensive line transitioning from Kenny Clark being the guy to Kenny Clark being one of the guys to eventually being, whenever that happens, the post-Kenny Clark Green Bay Packers. So that kind of sets up the question, how optimistic should we be on Devonte Wyatt? Researching this a little bit today and yesterday, I would say reasonably to quite optimistic about Devonte Wyatt. Earlier this offseason, we toyed around with a metric. I've gone back and forth on the name for it, but pressure quality or hit rate for pass rushes. Basically, we want to make sure when we're looking at pressures, how often a guy's putting pressure on the passer, what kind of pressure he's actually getting. Giving more weight to guys that are actually hitting the quarterback, so your hits and sacks. Pressures are great. It's great to get pressure on the quarterback. A formative, analytic memory for me is I think in the 2019 season, Mike Smith, then the outside linebackers coach for the Packers, went on a rant about how it was basically criminal that Za'Darius Smith was not getting more attention among the national media because of how many pressures he had on the quarterback. He had 105 pressures that year, counting the postseason. That's the most that I've got among Packers players dating back to 2006. According to Pro Football Focus's data, it's a fairly wide gap, too. Nobody's really gotten close to that number of pressures, but Za'Darius was getting after the quarterback every day, all day that season and was doing a great job at it. However, we have to point out that not all pressures are equal. Pressures encompass sacks, hits, and hurries, and it's important to note that not all those pressures are worth the same thing. Sacks are obviously the best. If you had a choice between having 2 sacks in a game and having, a dozen pressures, the 2 sacks are almost always going to be more impactful. Sacks are always more important than hurries and more important than hits. But I think looking at how those break down gives us an idea of where guys stand in terms of the quality of pressure they are getting on the quarterback. More pressures is always good. Better pressures is better yet. If you look at how the Packers were getting their pressures last year, Devonte Wyatt stands out in a bad way, but maybe not in a concerning way. Let me explain. Looking at how the Packers as a whole got their pressures last year, when we look at defensive line and edge rush players, Wyatt does stand out. Wyatt's pressures were mostly hurries, though. He had 48 pressures last year, which is good, and 4th on the team overall, behind Rashawn Gary, Kenny Clark, and Preston Smith. So that's good. However, just 11 of his 48 pressures involved contact with the quarterback, sacks and hits. That was the 3rd lowest figure on the team. And when you look at who is behind him, you start to get a little bit more concerned about what that could mean, because the only people with a lower contact rate on the quarterback were TJ Slayton, who the Packers don't really count on as a pass rusher anyway, and Justin Hollins, who only was with the team for a couple of weeks last year. That is standing out in a bad way. You want to be finishing more than that. You want to be getting to the quarterback more than Wyatt was. But I don't think it's concerning, and here's why. Over the last couple of days, I've gone back and researched the contact rates for guys that finished ahead of Wyatt in pressures to see if there's anything that we can see about how they grew as pass rushers or maybe changed from year to year. So now we can compare Devonte Wyatt to Kenny Clark, Rashawn Gary, and Preston Smith. Here's what I found. All 3 of those guys had a career contact rate on average higher than Wyatt's. From year to year, they were almost always higher than Wyatt. And I think, generally speaking, you'd say he'd be right on par with them as far as their pass rush goes in terms of the volume of pressure they are producing. He's certainly right there with Kenny Clark and Preston Smith. I think there is some evidence to suggest here that if you're good at rushing the passer, the sacks and the hits are going to come. And you're probably going to end up having a higher contact rate in general than Wyatt did last year. His low contact rate was probably an outlier more than it's something that we should be concerned about for his career as a whole. Just as a comparison, when we say it's a bad way to stand out, when we look at contact rate, Devonte Wyatt had a rate of 22.92%. Of his pressures ending in contact with the quarterback. Kenny Clark was just over 27%, in fact, 27.27%. So we're not talking about a whole lot of plays here. We're just talking about Wyatt converting a few more plays from hurries into hits and sacks. That could make a big difference over the course of the season. We also see when we're comparing these guys year over year, all these guys, Preston Smith, Rashawn Gary, Kenny Clark, had some volatility year to year, but they ended up being stable at higher averages than Wyatt was last year. There's year-to-year variation among all these guys, but most of them are consistent, close to their career average, within a couple percentage points up and down. Preston Smith is the most volatile, which I think if you looked at his career with the Packers, generally tracks from what you would say is basically how his career has played out. He's got a career contact rate of just over 39%. He has been both above and below that number by 10% year to year. He was 15% above that rate in 2022, and he was 10% below that rate in 2019. You can get some big variations here. But all these guys were pretty steady overall. Once they kind of figured things out as a player, usually by their second or third year, you started to see pretty consistent contact with the quarterback year over year over year. Smaller fluctuations as things goes on. The bottom line is, and I know this is a small sample size, But I think Wyatt's pressure numbers should look better even than they were in 2023 and 2024. And again, probably just a little bit of a historical aberration that his numbers worked out the way that they did. And I think that bodes well both for Wyatt and for the defense as a whole. And it could affect their decisions going forward. We've got, even if you're not looking into, Kenny Clark's stuff or where the Packers defensive line is going to go in the future, we can't forget that they have third-year option, or not third-year, fifth-year option decisions coming up on both Devonte Wyatt and Quay Walker at some point next offseason. So if Wyatt is able to statistically course correct a little bit in ways that are going to show up in meaningful ways on the field, hits on the quarterback and more sacks, that will help the Packers make a lot more comfortable decision, I think, on his fifth-year option, and will help the defense going forward too. I'm not really concerned about Devonte Wyatt. I think he's got a lot that he can bring to this defense. He's probably their most athletic defensive lineman, although now you technically have to group your edge rushers in with defensive linemen there as well. For our purposes going forward, we're going to maintain that defensive line edge rusher distinction. We should probably start calling them interior linemen and edge rushers, just for the sake of clarity, so we don't confuse things with how they're listed on the roster, because they're all defensive linemen now technically. But among their interior linemen, I think he is their best athlete. He's probably their most explosive pass rusher, and I think if he can play how it looks like he can play and how he did play in 2023, while just getting lucky a couple more times, we're going to be looking a lot more positively on Wyatt into 2025 and beyond than we might feel about him right now. But I feel pretty confident here sitting in May that the season is going to look a lot better for Devonte Wyatt than going forward. Want to give a shout out to our patrons and to our Patreon and Substack supporters as well. Patreon.com/thepowersweep, thepowersweep.substack.com. You can support us there for any dollar amount you choose, more or less. There's some variation within there. You can see how it works if you visit either of those links. We'd love your support. We're going to give you some more bonus content. We're trying to do it each and every week. And this week, tomorrow, Friday, May 31st, let's put it that way, whenever you happen to be listening to this, we're dropping our latest bonus content, looking at the uniforms of the AFC West. Who's got the best, who has the worst? Some good-looking uniforms out west, including a new set for the Denver Broncos. And we're going to have more bonus content each and every week. So if you choose to support us, it helps us keep the show going. It gets you that bonus content, and you get to hang out in our Discord server with fans from all over the world and do all sorts of fun stuff in there. It's a really fun group, and we have a lot of fun talking football and all sorts of other stuff together. It's a great time. So patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com. Hit us up both those places, and you can be a part of our crew going forward. Wanted to close out with a couple questions today, including fixing the entire NFL. But one thing we haven't really talked about a whole lot this offseason is the NFL's new kickoff rule. And Eric reminds us of that, asking, has Rich Bisaccia had any availability yet? Would love to get his new insights into how special teams body types might change with new kickoff rules. I assume it could have a real impact on the last few spots on the 53. Well, funny you should ask that, Eric, because Rich Bisaccia spoke to that exact thing in a press availability about 2 weeks ago, talking about everything with the new kickoff and how it could shake out here. I want to play you his full answer here. It's about 2 minutes long, so hang with us here on a longer soundbite. But here is his full assessment of the situation with the new kickoff rule. He's going to give an answer to one question, then someone's going to follow up, and he'll give a little bit more insight into what he thinks about it. But here's Rich Bisaccia.
We're putting a lot of work into the play itself, and we're trying to get some feedback from a lot of the players that have played the front line of kickoff return. That's basically what it's all going to be with those 10 guys up front, and what the drops would look like, what a slide block now looks like, or a sink block looks like, or some of those things. So we've had a lot of film on it as of late. It's been good. It's been good conversation back and forth with the players. So it's new for everyone. That's the good part. So we'll see what it's going to. We're not really sure what it's going to look like, right? And ours is a little bit different than the actual XFL because we have these two float players. So, and we have the ability to have two returners if we want, where the XFL just had one returner and all 10 on both kickoff and kickoff return were on the same line. Now in the return game, we have the ability to have two float players. So I think it'll look a little different. Some people think it's going to be exciting. Some think it's going to be dull. I think, we all have to wait and see, right? But the good part is, because of the proximity of the players, 5 to 6 yards apart, we can practice that a little bit different than we've practiced kickoff in the past. So I think hopefully that'll be advantageous to some of us.
You fall on the exciting or dull end of that spectrum in terms of your own personal?
Well, I think we have an exciting guy, so he makes it exciting, sometimes no matter what. But I think the exciting thing for us as coaches and for players that might be the bottom end of the 53, we didn't lose the play. So I think that's an exciting part, is that we still have the play. It's going to be a radical change. It's going to be the same for everyone. So I think how we approach it, right? The glass half full or half empty. In our opinion, it's half full. It's going to give guys a chance to keep playing kickoff and kickoff return, and we're going to do the best we can to be the best at it that we can be.
So a bunch to unpack there. Bisaccia, as we usually hear from him, is very thoughtful. He's thought about this from every angle. Now, just as an aside, I would encourage you, if you don't make a regular practice of this, whenever you see either on social media or on Packers.com that the coordinators and coaches have been talking, try to give that a listen as often as you can. Just because you gain a lot of insights into how this process works. And I think this is a really good example of that. First, not first, but right there at the end, you see that he's very interested, or was very interested, in keeping the play around because of what it means for roster construction. These are guys that are counting on these kind of reps and these plays being available to make the roster. So if you eliminate that part of the game, that's one more area or one more opportunity taken away from guys that might be on that roster bubble. But as we know, if you can stand out on special teams, you can still make a roster in the NFL. So having one more opportunity there is one more chance to make this. So it doesn't really talk about body types, but he does talk about the importance of having that available for those guys that are on the bottom end of the roster. He also talks about the importance of practicing, being able to practice this differently. If you think about the mechanics of the old kickoff, there was not a lot of ways that you could practice it effectively or safely. And that was the big concern, generally speaking, with kickoffs in general, is it's not a safe play. You end up with a lot of people running full speed into each other, often with a long, long run-up. Back in my lone season of playing college football, this was the thing that I hated most, being on scout team. When the ones are practicing kickoff and you've got to practice kick return, if you're on one of those back couple lines of a traditional kickoff return, what you're going to see is you're going to be standing back there and you're going to watch the kickoff man come down and kick the ball over your head. Got to make sure your returner catches it, that it didn't land in your hands, because that'd be bad. But if you're back there, you got to make sure the returner catches it. You got to spot your other guys with you to make sure that you can form up and get in position for whatever return you've got on. And then basically what you got to do is you got to run upfield in formation with your other guys and basically absorb a hit from a guy coming downfield having gotten a 35 to 40-yard running head start at you. There are guys, and there used to be guys in the NFL whose whole job was the wedge buster. Back before the wedge was outlawed in kickoff return stuff, you could have 4 guys basically holding hands back on a kickoff return, and they would just form a wedge, and that's where your kickoff return guy would basically hide. You'd put your most maniacal kickoff coverage guy in a position where his whole job was to just launch himself into that wedge and try to take out as many of them as he could so your other guys can come in and make a tackle. Do you see why they might want to change how the kickoff works? You've got a huge possibility for injury on 8-10 plays a game, most of which happen pretty much by rote anyway. You can't practice that in training camp. Why would you? Why would you want to do practice for things like that? You're just going to end up burning out your guys that you're actually going to need in the regular season on these practice plays that have a very low upside to how they're going to actually affect the game. So he's looking forward to this new rule, allowing you to actually practice kickoff returns because you're not going to be running full speed head-on into each other with a giant run-up. He also points out that this affects more than just the returners. I think when we think of the kickoff return, a lot of what we're looking at here is the return men. He points out in a couple different areas there, guys trying to make the roster for one, but also the formation and how things go, that there's other parts of this at play. You have your frontline guys who are going to be there lining up directly across from the coverage team trying to get in position to make blocks, but you have also these two float players who line up a little ways behind that line as well. That strategy and who you put where is still in progress. And just to shamelessly rip off somebody else's take, the jet sweep guy on our Discord server pointed out as we were having this discussion, it's wild that they are doing this, just implementing it with essentially no play testing at all. They're banking really hard on what happened in the XFL and USFL and all of that being sort of their test case, tweaking it a little bit. But we're just going straight into preseason, straight into guys making the roster based on how this thing is going to go with essentially no play testing at all. And we're just going to see how it works. That's crazy, but also super interesting because we get to see how that plays out. So it's going to be a fun process to see how this all works out. Finally, to close out today, Rudy, the good question asker, asks this: if, like me, you like maps and trying to apply logic to things, Googling proposed NFL realignment is a fun rabbit hole. Yes, it is. I've done that many, many times. You're declared the NFL Ultimate Terrific Supreme Mega Poobah for 24 hours. What, if any, league or team realignment are you doing? The three most obvious geographical anomalies are the Cowboys in the NFC East, the Colts in the AFC South, and the Dolphins in the AFC East. I don't ever see the league vacating the Cowboys rivalries with all the teams of the NFC East, but I wonder about a Colts-Dolphins swap. So what say you, Ultimate Terrific Supreme Mega Poobah? I appreciate your appointment to this role, Rudy, and I will take my best crack at this. This is something that I've toyed around with a few times over the years. NFL realignment, what should it look like? Assuming we're not going to have any league expansion here, I think the thing that makes the most sense is to keep the two conferences, not the teams within those conferences, as we'll get to here in a second, but keep two conferences and try to get as close to geographical proximity as we can within four smaller divisions, or four smaller from the conference perspective, not smaller from what we currently have, because they're going to be actually just two divisions per conference. So in Conference 1, and I haven't come up with a fancy name for this because we're going to do away with the national and American conferences because both of those have to kind of date back to the National and American Football Leagues, back to the pre-merger days. Generally speaking, not exclusively speaking, but that's where things generally break down a little bit there. But in our two leagues, we have two divisions, or in our two conferences, we have two divisions each. In the first conference, we have what I'm calling the Frontier Division and the Atlantic Coast Division. The Frontier Division is going to include the Cardinals, the Rams, the 49ers, and the Seahawks, as well as the Broncos, the Chiefs, the Raiders, and the Chargers. Basically, that's all of the Western teams, from the Chiefs to the West Coast of the United States, are in the Frontier Division. In the Atlantic Coast divisions, we have the Ravens, the Patriots, the Jets, and the Bills, as well as the Eagles, the Commanders, the Giants, and Panthers. So basically, this is the AFC East and the NFC East right now, minus the Dolphins and the Cowboys. So we swap in the Ravens and the Panthers from the AFC North and the NFC South, and we subtract the Miami Dolphins and the Dallas Cowboys. In the other conference, my two divisions are the Great Lakes Division and the Gulf Coast Division. The Great Lakes Division is the Packers, the Lions, the Bears, and the Vikings, so we preserve the NFC North unchanged because they're so close to each other geographically, there's really no reason to separate them. And we add in the Colts, the Bengals, the Browns, and the Steelers. So the Colts come from the AFC South, and the Bengals, the Browns, and the Steelers come over from the AFC North. Generally speaking, we've got we've got teams all connected to one of the Great Lakes in here. If you wanted to swap the Steelers and Bills, you could probably do that as well. But I like this group as it stands right now. Then to close things out, the Gulf Coast Division has the Cowboys, the Titans, the Falcons, the Texans, the Jaguars, the Dolphins, and the Buccaneers and Saints. This is probably my favorite division. I got everybody in a state that borders the Gulf Coast there. I think that ends up being pretty cool, except for the Titans, but they're close enough. They and the Panthers are pretty hard to place geographically, but these are my four divisions here. I tried to preserve as many of the rivalries as I could, except for the Cowboys in the NFC East. Dallas can rot for all I care. They don't belong in the East. There's no part of them that needs to be in the East, unless if you wanted to go back to the old NFC Central alignment, you should put the Cowboys in the Central and the Buccaneers in the East. That would make much more sense because the Cowboys are in the central part of the country, the Buccaneers much more in the eastern part of the country, but I digress. But I think this does a lot to preserve kind of those regional areas and keep everybody close to each other, which should help out with travel a little bit. I also like getting rid of the AFC South, which is, in my opinion, the worst division in the NFL. You've got 2 expansion teams in that division and 2 teams that relocated from elsewhere. No more. At least now you've got some geographic sense with where those 4 teams are. There is no West Coast presence really for one of these conferences, but I think with how the NFL does all their TV stuff right now, that's not really going to matter all that much anyway. And you gotta make compromises somewhere, and this is basically where the geography of the league breaks down. I even went a little bit further and looked into how you would schedule something like this. Here's my proposed schedule rotation. I'd say every year you have 10 games against your divisional opponents. You're going to be on a rotation through this league or through your smaller league, your smaller division. You'll play 3 teams every year, twice a year, so that's 6 games. And then 4 of the other 4 teams in your division you'll play once each, so that'll total up to 10 games. Then you'll play 4 games against half of the other division within your conference. So the Packers in the Great Lakes division would play 3 teams twice. Let's just say this first year to be the Lions, the Bears, and the Vikings. They play twice. Then they've got 4 games total against the Colts, Bengals, Browns, and Steelers. Then they could play the Cowboys, Titans, Falcons, and Texans from the Gulf Coast division in their first year. Then we've got 3 games we need to figure out the other way, and I think they're all going to go against the other conference. I'll say 1 game against a team that finished with the same conference ranking as you, and then 2 we would get really crazy with and pick those opponents during a televised event of some kind. So the NFL loves their off-season content. Why not do something that really gives us a chance to do some intrigue here with who you're actually going to be playing? Right now you can map out schedule rotations for years and years and years if you want. Let's add a little bit of randomness in here and figure out 2 opponents live on TV with representatives from every team present. We could do this like a draft where you have the opportunity to pick an opponent, or we could do this as a lottery where teams are randomly paired together. We would be doing a bunch of games here, so we could slowly work this out together. That would be, I think, some intriguing content. And I think that would be a way to finish out the schedule. And then from there, you go in and actually make the schedule. And that gets to be a little bit challenging, but that's a problem for somebody else. We'll have the schedule makers that we hire do their supercomputers and all of that. They can figure it out. That's their job. I'm just the supreme leader of the NFL here for 24 hours. And now that I've fixed the NFL, I can hand it over to other people to change things out. I think that's a lot of fun. I think doing stuff like this is a lot of fun, and I would love to see some stuff like this implemented eventually, just because I think it's fun to shake things up a little bit from time to time, and I'm not sure that the current NFL alignment necessarily breaks down super well with a 17-game schedule. You might as well get a little bit weird, and that's what the offseason is for here, too. We're a long way from any football, so we might as well talk about some weird stuff. How would we change the NFL? Well, there you have it. I changed the NFL for you. That's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.